Ethan Brooks always believed that grief had a sound. It wasn't crying or shouting or breaking things. It was the silence waiting for you when you unlocked your front door after everyone else had gone home. My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 32 years old, and I own a custom furniture workshop outside Asheville, North Carolina. My crew builds dining tables, rocking chairs, and handcrafted cabinets that usually end up becoming part of someone else's happiest memories. Ironically, I spent the last 4 years avoiding the kind of memories families make around those tables. My fiancée, Lily, was killed by a drunk driver just 6 weeks before our wedding. One careless decision from a stranger turned every plan we'd made into unopened boxes stored in my attic. Since then, I buried myself in work because wood was easier to understand than people. If you treated it with patience, it usually healed. Hearts didn't. On a chilly Friday evening in October, after finishing a long week sanding walnut tabletops, I decided to eat somewhere other than the diner across from my shop. My younger sister had been telling me for months that hiding inside my routine wasn't the same thing as moving forward. Against my better judgment, I drove into downtown Asheville and walked into Magnolia House, a cozy restaurant famous for hosting anniversaries, birthdays, and marriage proposals. It wasn't exactly the place a man trying to avoid reminders of love should choose, but I figured a quiet dinner wouldn't hurt. A hostess led me toward a small table near the window, where candles reflected softly against the glass while couples laughed over dessert. I ordered grilled salmon and sweet tea, then found myself absent-mindedly watching people instead of reading the menu. That's when the front door opened and she walked in. She looked about 30, wearing a simple navy blue dress beneath a cream-colored coat that had clearly been worn for years but carefully cared for. She carried herself with quiet dignity, though there was a nervousness in her eyes that suggested she'd spent the entire drive rehearsing tonight in her head. She paused near the entrance, smoothing a loose strand of chestnut hair behind her ear before spotting a reserved table decorated with a small bouquet and a handwritten reservation card. She smiled to herself and walked over, checking her phone every few seconds. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. A waiter politely asked if she wanted to order while she waited. She smiled and said, "He's probably just running late." 20 more minutes slipped by. Around the room, conversations continued, but people had started noticing. She read another message on her phone, and I watched every bit of color disappear from her face. Her shoulders sagged as though someone had quietly removed the strength holding her upright. She locked the screen without replying, stared at the untouched candle flickering between the empty chairs, and pressed her lips together, desperately trying not to cry in front of a room filled with strangers celebrating love while hers had apparently ended with a text message. The waiter awkwardly removed the second menu from her table, not realizing the gesture hurt more than the message itself. She whispered, almost too softly to hear, "I should have known." No anger. No scene. Just disappointment so deep it seemed familiar, like this wasn't the first time someone had made her feel easy to leave behind. I looked back down at my untouched dinner, telling myself it wasn't my business. But something about the way she kept pretending she was fine reminded me too much of the version of myself who smiled through condolences while dying inside. Some moments ask nothing from us. Others quietly reveal who we're willing to become. I took a slow breath, pushed my chair back from the table, picked up my untouched plate, and started walking toward the lonely candle burning in front of the woman everyone else had already decided to ignore. Marcus, the restaurant manager, noticed me crossing the dining room and stepped aside with a curious smile, probably assuming I knew the woman. I stopped a respectful distance from her table so she wouldn't feel cornered and spoke softly enough that only she could hear. "I'm sorry if this is strange, but I couldn't help noticing you've been sitting here by yourself for a while. If you'd rather be left alone, I'll understand completely. But if not, would you mind if I shared this table? I promise I'm only trying to make sure tonight doesn't end with you believing everyone in this room forgot you existed." She looked up, startled, her hazel eyes still glossy with tears she refused to let fall. For several seconds she simply stared at me, as though kindness from a stranger required more explanation than cruelty from someone she had trusted. Finally she let out a small, embarrassed laugh. "You're making this very difficult." I smiled gently. "Is that a yes or a polite way of telling me to go back to my own table?" Another tiny laugh escaped before she nodded toward the empty chair across from her. "You can sit, but I should warn you I'm probably terrible company tonight. I've had worse dinner conversations with my accountant, I replied, earning the first genuine smile she'd shown all evening. As I settled into the chair, the tension around us eased just enough for the waiter to return. Before he could ask anything uncomfortable, I simply said, "We'll keep the reservation." The waiter nodded with obvious relief and disappeared toward the kitchen. The woman tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear before extending her hand across the candlelit table. "I'm Nora Sullivan." I shook it carefully. "Ethan Brooks." Her hand felt cold despite the warm restaurant. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You really didn't have to do this." "Maybe not," I admitted. "But sometimes people need someone to interrupt a bad memory before it becomes permanent." She lowered her eyes, and after a long silence she unlocked her phone and slid it across the table toward me. The final message on the screen read, "I'm sorry. I can't do this. I met someone else a few months ago. You deserve better than pretending tonight means anything. Don't wait for me." There wasn't even a signature, as if the man couldn't spare enough courage to type his own name. I handed the phone back without commenting on him. "That message says a lot about him," I said, "and absolutely nothing about you." She swallowed hard. "His name is Ryan. Today would have been our 4th anniversary. He made the reservation himself 2 weeks ago. He kept telling me he wanted to celebrate properly because we'd both been working too much." She forced another smile that broke halfway across her face. "Apparently he just wanted one last nice place to break my heart." The candle flickered between us while the weight of those words settled into the space neither of us hurried to fill. When our meals arrived, she barely touched hers. Instead, she kept apologizing for ruining my evening, until I finally laughed and said, "Nora, you're talking to a man whose idea of excitement last Tuesday was buying a new electric sander. Trust me, this is the most interesting dinner I've had in months." That finally earned a real laugh, warm enough to turn a few nearby heads. It reminded me how different laughter sounded when it escaped instead of being forced. Conversation slowly found its rhythm. She told me she designed children's library spaces for a nonprofit that renovated schools across western North Carolina. "Kids deserve places that make them want to read," she explained. "If a room feels magical, they'll keep coming back." I found myself smiling because I built furniture for schools whenever local budgets fell short. We had probably spent years improving the same communities without ever crossing paths. When I mentioned my workshop, her eyes brightened for the first time all evening. "You're the one who donated those handcrafted reading benches to Pine Ridge Elementary last spring?" I blinked in surprise. "You know about those?" She laughed softly. "I helped design the room they went into. The children called it the Story Forest because of the carved oak leaves on the sides." For the first time in years, the conversation stopped feeling like two strangers making polite small talk. It felt like two lonely people accidentally discovering they'd been walking parallel roads all along without realizing someone else understood the journey. The restaurant emptied around us so gradually that neither of us noticed until Marcus began lowering a few of the lights for closing time. Nora looked at the clock and covered her face with both hands. "We've been sitting here for almost 3 hours." I glanced through the window at the quiet streets outside and smiled. That might be my personal record for voluntarily talking to another human being. She laughed, the sound lighter now, no longer carrying the weight that had filled the evening when she first walked through the door. As we stepped outside, a cool autumn breeze swept colorful leaves across the sidewalk. I walked her to her car, an older silver Subaru with a cracked university parking sticker still clinging to the windshield. Before she unlocked the driver's door, she hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure. Why did you really come over tonight?" Most people looked away. Some pretended not to notice. That would have been easier. I leaned against the car for a moment, searching for words that felt honest instead of dramatic. 4 years ago, I lost someone I was supposed to marry. After that, I spent a long time hoping nobody would ask if I was okay because I knew I wasn't. Every time someone ignored my silence, it became easier to believe I was invisible. When I saw you sitting alone tonight, I recognized that look. I couldn't fix what happened, but I also couldn't pretend I hadn't seen it. Nora's eyes softened. I'm sorry about your fiancée. Her name was Lily, I said quietly. She made every room feel brighter without even trying. Nora nodded gently. Whoever she was, she'd probably be proud that you're still the kind of man who notices people. That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected. Before getting into her car, she pulled a small notebook from her purse, tore out a page, and wrote down her phone number. I'd like to buy you dinner someday, she said with a shy smile. One where nobody gets abandoned halfway through the reservation. I accepted the paper with a grin. That sounds like a much better plan. Over the next several weeks, messages became coffee breaks became Saturday walks through farmers' markets, and Saturday walks somehow turned into an unspoken routine neither of us wanted to interrupt. Nora had a calm way of listening that made ordinary conversations feel important. She celebrated little things most people overlooked, like the smell of fresh rain on cedar wood or the excitement in a child's voice after finding a favorite book. She wasn't loud, dramatic, or trying to impress anyone. She simply made the world feel gentler. One crisp Sunday afternoon she visited my workshop for the first time. My employees greeted her warmly before returning to their projects, and I showed her stacks of walnut, maple, and cherry waiting to become someone's future heirlooms. She ran her fingers across a freshly sanded tabletop and smiled. You know what's beautiful about this? She asked. I shrugged. The grain? No, she answered. Every scratch disappears because someone cared enough to keep working on it. I looked at her, realizing she wasn't talking about wood anymore. Before I could respond, my foreman, Ben, walked over carrying his 6-year-old son, Oliver, who had insisted on visiting after school. The little boy marched straight up to Nora holding a tiny birdhouse he'd painted bright blue. Do you like it? He asked proudly. Nora crouched to his height as though no one else existed. I love it, she said. It looks like the birds are getting a beach house. Oliver giggled and immediately began telling her an elaborate story about squirrels trying to steal birdseed. I watched the conversation unfold from a few feet away, surprised by how naturally children trusted her. She wasn't performing kindness. She simply possessed it. Later, after Ben and Oliver left, Nora admitted quietly, Ryan always said I cared too much about other people. He thought it made me weak. I stopped sanding the edge of a cabinet and looked directly at her. Anyone who mistakes kindness for weakness has probably never met someone truly strong. She smiled, but behind that smile I noticed something lingering, an old fear that maybe believing in people had cost her too much already. Neither of us realized then that the past she thought had finally ended with one unanswered anniversary reservation was only beginning to find its way back into our lives. Ryan returned on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, almost 2 months after disappearing without another word. Nora called me that evening, but instead of her usual calm voice, all I heard at first was silence broken by uneven breathing. I left the workshop immediately and drove to her apartment across town. When she opened the door, she was wearing an oversized sweatshirt, her eyes swollen from crying, and she looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. A bouquet of expensive white roses sat unopened in the trash can beside the kitchen counter. He came back, she whispered before I even asked. We sat at her small dining table while rain tapped softly against the windows. She wrapped both hands around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. Ryan showed up at my office today. He acted like nothing had happened. He said he made a mistake, that the woman he left me for wasn't who he thought she was. I felt my jaw tighten but stayed quiet. Nora continued, staring at the table instead of me. When I told him there was nothing left to talk about, he laughed and said I was only pretending to move on because I couldn't find anyone better. Then he saw a picture of us at the charity book fair on my desk. She finally looked at me, fear replacing sadness. He knows about you now. What did he do? I asked. He said people like you always play the hero until things get difficult. He told me you'd get tired of my baggage and leave just like everyone else. The word hung heavily between us. It wasn't just an insult. It was the fear she'd been quietly carrying ever since that night at the restaurant. I reached across the table and gently took her trembling hand. Nora, listen to me. She shook her head before I could finish. You don't understand. Ryan knows my biggest insecurities because I trusted him with them. He knows exactly which words will stay in my head after he walks away. Tears rolled down her cheeks. Part of me hates that his voice is still louder than my own. I moved beside her instead of sitting across from her. Then borrow mine until yours gets stronger. She closed her eyes as fresh tears slipped down her face. I'm scared, Ethan. Of him? She slowly shook her head. No. I'm scared of believing in happiness again. Every time I start feeling safe, something happens that reminds me how quickly everything can disappear. I understood that fear better than I wished I did. After losing Lily, I'd spent years believing that loving someone only guaranteed another heartbreak waiting somewhere in the future. I had hidden inside that belief because it felt safer than hope. Looking at Nora, I realized grief and betrayal leave behind the same lie. They convince you that protecting your heart means never opening it again. Can I tell you something? I asked softly. She nodded. For 4 years I kept Lily's wedding ring locked in the top drawer of my bedroom. Not because I wanted to wear it again, but because I thought moving forward meant I was leaving her behind. Last month, after our third Saturday at the farmer's market, I finally put that ring away in a memory box. Not because I stopped loving her, but because I realized she was part of my past, not a wall around my future. Nora stared at me without speaking. You're not replacing anyone, I continued. And neither am I. We're just two people who found each other after life knocked us down. She leaned against my shoulder, letting out a slow, shaky breath she'd probably been holding all day. Neither of us noticed the rain had stopped outside. The apartment had become completely quiet except for the steady rhythm of the old wall clock. After several minutes she whispered, "Would you stay a little longer?" I smiled gently. I wasn't planning on going anywhere. For the first time since Ryan had walked back into her life, she allowed herself to believe she didn't have to face the storm alone. Neither of us realized, however, that Ryan wasn't finished trying to reclaim the control he had already thrown away. Ryan's apology turned into obsession faster than either of us expected. During the following weeks, flowers kept appearing outside Nora's office, handwritten notes arrived at her apartment even though she never answered them, and mutual friends quietly admitted he had been asking questions about me, my workshop, and how serious our relationship had become. Nora blocked his number, then another, then another. Each time, he found a different way to reach her. What frightened her most wasn't that he wanted another chance. It was that he refused to accept she had already made her decision. One Friday evening, our nonprofit hosted a fundraising gala inside the newly renovated Ashton Children's Library, a project Nora had spent nearly a year helping design. Community leaders, teachers, donors, and local families filled the building with laughter while children proudly showed visitors their colorful reading corners. I stood beside Nora near the entrance, watching kids climb onto the handcrafted benches my crew had built months earlier. "This," she whispered, looking around the room, "is my favorite project I've ever worked on." Before I could answer, the atmosphere shifted. Conversation slowed. Several guests turned toward the entrance. Ryan had walked in wearing an expensive charcoal suit and the confident smile of someone convinced every room belonged to him. He carried a large bouquet of lilies, the same flowers Nora once told him were her favorite. He ignored every curious stare and walked straight toward us. "Nora," he announced loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "I've made mistakes, but I'm here to fix them." Nora instinctively stepped closer to me, but I kept my voice calm. "She asked you to stop contacting her." Ryan barely acknowledged I had spoken. His eyes stayed fixed on Nora. "You really think this guy understands you? He's only here because he likes rescuing broken people." Several people nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. Nora's face went pale, yet before I could respond, she surprised both of us. She stepped forward on her own. "No, Ryan," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "He never rescued me. He simply treated me with the respect you never did." Ryan laughed dismissively. "You're throwing away 4 years together because of one mistake?" Nora slowly shook her head. "No. I'm walking away because your one mistake showed me who you really are." You didn't lose me the night you sent that message. You lost me every time you made me believe I wasn't enough. The room had fallen completely silent. Even the children seemed to sense something important was happening. Ryan looked around and realized no one was standing with him. His confidence cracked for the first time. "You'll regret this," he muttered. Nora looked him directly in the eyes. "The only thing I regret is spending so long believing I had to earn basic kindness." After a long, tense moment, Ryan dropped the bouquet into the nearest trash bin and walked out without another word. The front doors closed behind him, leaving only silence. Then, unexpectedly, applause began from the back of the room. One teacher clapped. Then another. Soon dozens of people were applauding not because of drama, but because they had just watched a woman choose her own worth instead of settling for someone else's opinion of it. Nora turned toward me with tears filling her eyes. "I thought I'd be terrified if I ever had to face him again." I gently squeezed her hand. "Were you?" She smiled through the tears. "No. Because this time I wasn't standing there wondering if I deserved better. I already knew I did." Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and volunteers folded the last of the chairs, we wandered quietly through the children's reading garden behind the library. Tiny lights glowed among the trees while autumn leaves drifted across the stone path. I stopped walking, reached into my jacket pocket, and pulled out a small velvet box I'd been carrying for nearly a week, waiting for the moment that finally felt right. I held the small velvet box in my hand for a moment before opening it, not because I was nervous about my answer, but because I wanted Nora to understand that this moment wasn't about replacing the life either of us had lost. It was about choosing the one we had slowly built together. She looked from the box to my face, her eyes already beginning to fill with tears. "Ethan," she whispered. I smiled softly. The night we met, I thought I was walking over to rescue someone from a terrible evening. I was wrong. We ended up rescuing each other. She covered her mouth as I continued. "You reminded me that grief doesn't have to be the last chapter of a person's story. You showed me that kindness isn't weakness, that hope can return quietly, and that love doesn't ask us to forget yesterday before giving tomorrow a chance." I opened the ring box. Inside rested a simple oval diamond set in a vintage gold band that had been handcrafted by a local jeweler. "Nora Sullivan," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion rising in my chest, "the happiest parts of my life now begin with ordinary moments. Morning coffee while you tell me about another library project. Listening to you laugh at terrible jokes that aren't funny. Watching children climb onto benches my crew built because you imagined a room where they could dream. I don't want extraordinary days if they don't include you. Will you marry me? Will you let us keep building a life where neither of us ever has to wonder if we're enough again?" Before I could finish, tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded over and over. "Yes," she cried. "Yes, Ethan. 1,000 times yes." I slipped the ring onto her finger, and before either of us realized what was happening, several volunteers who had been locking up the library noticed us through the windows. They quietly stepped outside, smiling and applauding as Nora threw her arms around my neck. One elderly librarian wiped away tears before laughing that she'd never seen a better ending to a story. 6 months later, beneath the towering oak trees of the historic Biltmore Gardens, we were married in a ceremony filled with family, friends, and dozens of children from the schools Nora had helped transform over the years. Instead of expensive decorations, the aisle was lined with handcrafted wooden lanterns built by my workshop and painted by elementary students whose libraries we had renovated together. My sister stood beside me as my best woman, while Ben proudly served as best man. Little Oliver carefully carried our rings, stopping halfway down the aisle to wave enthusiastically at everyone before remembering he was supposed to keep walking. The entire garden burst into laughter, instantly dissolving every remaining trace of wedding day nerves. When Nora reached me, she looked more beautiful than I had imagined on every lonely evening after losing Lily. During my vows I held both of her hands and said, "I promise never to measure your worth by your worst day. I promise that when life becomes heavy, you won't have to carry it by yourself. I promise to choose patience over pride, understanding over assumption, and love over fear, every single day." Nora smiled through happy tears before reading hers. I used to believe being left behind meant there was something missing inside me. Then one quiet man walked across a restaurant carrying his dinner plate and asked if he could share my table. You never tried to erase my past. You simply reminded me that my future was still waiting. Thank you for seeing me before I remembered how to see myself. Years later, our home was no longer the quiet place I once hurried through just to avoid hearing the silence. Children's books filled the shelves, muddy shoes gathered near the front door after neighborhood reading clubs, and laughter echoed from every room during family dinners around the walnut table my crew had built together. Every October, on the anniversary of the night we met, we returned to Magnolia House and requested the exact same table by the window. Marcus, now the owner, always placed a single candle between us before smiling and saying, "Best reservation we ever kept." We would laugh, order far too much dessert, and remember that one heartbreaking evening had become the beginning of everything beautiful that followed. Sometimes life doesn't change because of grand speeches or perfect timing. Sometimes it changes because one ordinary person decides not to walk past another person's pain. Looking back, I no longer remember that restaurant as the place where someone failed to show up. I remember it as the place where two strangers discovered that the greatest love stories often begin the moment someone chooses compassion over convenience. All I asked was, "Would you mind if I shared this table?" Neither of us could have imagined that one simple question would become the first sentence of the rest of our lives.